Hi everybody, welcome to the first lecture for CIK220, Arctic to Uluru, Comparative Studies in Indigenous Policy. And then I'll follow this with a sort of an informal lecture, if you like, that hopefully will initiate some discussion on the discussion board. There is a strong culture of blaming Aboriginal people and Aboriginal affairs, and this is intermeshed with the blame that Australian society places on Aboriginal people. This began with the initial confrontations between the settlers and Aboriginal people. Now, I should point out here that an important support factor for Aboriginal people in Australia historically has been the voluntary support and assistance of white Australians. They have been crucial to Aboriginal advancement. For example, we've probably heard of Eddie Mabo, but very few of us will be able to tell us the names of the white Australian lawyers who represented him for nothing. There have been many examples of this. The first Aboriginal medical service that was established in the early 1970s in Redfern did not have a budget to attract and retain health professionals. So white Australian health professionals volunteered their time. Again, there are so many examples of this. There's the freedom rides that took place in the 1960s, where Charles Perkins, a couple of other Aboriginal people, and a whole lot of white Australian university students hired a bus and drove around New South Wales country towns protesting about the discrimination that Aboriginal people so overtly experienced. Other examples of this include the Vincent Lingiari Wave Hill Walk-Off, the strike. Vincent Lingiari and his people went on strike for about 8 years for equal wages and working conditions. While they were on strike, they had to leave the property they were employed, and they had no food and water, so white Australians volunteered their time and went out there and provided them with these things. They didn't need to be there, they didn't need to do it. There are many examples of these. I don't have the time right now to get into them, but I think it's a very, very important point to be clear about. Okay, returning now to what I was talking about. Countries such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the USA have all had similar Aboriginal policies. According to Aboriginal academic Professor Judy Atkinson, there have been 3 stages of Aboriginal policy in these countries. These include invasion, the involvement of well-meaning and paternalistic groups, the continuing reassessment of government responsibilities to Indigenous needs, and all of these 3 things continue today, I might add. So terminology has been an important aspect of government policy. For example, terms such as save, savages, these sorts of terms were put on Aboriginal people to influence the way other people felt about them when those in power did things such as develop Aboriginal policy. So terms such as saving, the notion there was that we better come in and save these people, and that often meant we better make them Christians so when they die they can go to heaven. Okay. Now, since then, it's been realised that Aboriginal people are probably among the most religious people in the world. Everything they did evolved around religion, but maybe I'll get into that at a later lecture. Terms such as Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native, these are not Aboriginal words. These are Western terms that were developed by Western people and placed on Aboriginal people. They have nothing to do with Aboriginal people, and I'll return to this a little later. In the very early days of colonisation, Aboriginal people had violent conflicts with the settlers, and Aboriginal people suffered immensely from introduced diseases, labour exploitation, and the relegation to the status of animals. I mentioned labour exploitation there. It's one of the reasons why Indigenous people around the world are living in poverty today. It has nothing to do with the fact that they didn't work. If we were to put a video on of the White House in the United States from 100 years ago, what we would see is that the people feeding the children, cooking the meals, cleaning the house, maintaining the gardens are all African Americans, okay? None of whom were paid. Indigenous people around the world have often been a means of labour exploitation. In Australia, Indigenous people were the backbone of the cattle industry. This is where you see that sort of cowboy influence among Aboriginal people. Country music, Slim Dusty, older Aboriginal men wearing jeans and cowboy boots and cowboy hats. They were the backbone of the cattle industry, and they worked for rations of flour, sugar and tea. They didn't have to be paid award wages because award wages were only paid to humans. And at this time, Aboriginal people came under the Flora and Fauna Act, which meant that they came under the Plants and Animals Act. So there was no call on employers to provide them with award wages. So Aboriginal people have always worked in the cattle industry, and when it became time to pay them equal wages, they were all sacked. Okay, so the children of these people who worked and didn't get wages, didn't get superannuation, didn't get long service leave, didn't get increments, are going to be in a different position to the children of parents who did get these financial benefits. There's no doubt about that. But what we've seen since 1967, when the Aboriginal referendum took place, which meant that Aboriginal people moved away from flora and fauna and sort of moved into Australian citizenship, since then Aboriginal people today are politicians, are lawyers, are doctors, are teachers, are in the police force, social workers, psychologists, professors. They're internationally renowned sports people. They're doing extremely well despite the fact that they were under the Flora and Fauna Act up until so recently. So a century after the government took the approach of protectionism to Aboriginal policy, this meant that they would create Aboriginal missions and reserves where Aboriginal people were separated from white people so that they could not be exploited anymore. They were also, of course, not considered human at this time, so they did not reap any benefits from this policy at all. Essentially, this policy meant that they were restricted to these reserves and missions. Again, we see the presence of terminology such as protection and Aboriginal protectors being used in a misleading way. Now, although Australia calls itself a multicultural society today, at this time Australia was heavily involved in declaring themselves a white Australia. Australia had an official white Australia policy. So this meant that the government settled on one way to deal with Aboriginal people, and that was assimilation. Now, how this took place, and this is very important, because if the government thought that you were a real Aborigine, you had all of the physical characteristics that they associated with being a real Aborigine, you would go on to one of these reserves. And on these reserves, you were expected to sit down and basically die out peacefully. You were given flour, tea and sugar and tobacco and these sorts of things. And ultimately all that happened is you ended up with diseases such as diabetes. Now, if you were considered to be a part Aborigine by those in power, you would end up being removed from your parents at a young age and placed in an institution where they would train you to be white Australians. Okay? So if you were considered a real Aborigine, you would go on to a reserve and die out peacefully. If you were considered a part Aborigine, you would be absorbed into white Australia and you would eventually just totally assimilate and forget about your Aboriginal past. That was the plan. Now, I say this is important to point out because there's this perception in Australian society that indigeneity and Indigenous disadvantage are determined by someone's physical characteristics. This is completely wrong. Things such as skin colour and physical characteristics have nothing to do with indigeneity and have nothing to do with Indigenous disadvantage. Indigenous disadvantage, according to international literature, is determined by disconnection to land, disconnection to culture, disconnection to people, disconnection to family, these sorts of things. Okay? Nothing to do with skin colour. Native Americans, for example, have never been black. They identify as red. The Sami, who were the indigenous people whose land was sort of colonised by 4 different countries, Russia, Sweden, Finland and Norway, are fair-skinned people who look like average Europeans. The Ainu, who were the traditional owners of Japan, had fairer skin colour than their Korean colonisers. Okay, so indigeneity and Indigenous disadvantage have nothing to do with physical characteristics such as skin colour. This is why some people can speak their language and some people cannot. Some people can prove native title and some people cannot. Now, I am not saying that those who have the physical characteristics that we associate with Aboriginality do not have any problems. Of course, we only need to see the literature to see the problems that they have long experienced. Now, so when the government's policy of protectionism changed to assimilation, it became evident that Aboriginal people were not dying out and therefore a new policy was needed. And again, this policy of assimilation was considered a way for governments to continue to work towards eliminating Aboriginal people, and in a way that wasn't so violent and wasn't so confrontational, and therefore it didn't make Australia look to be as bad as what things were happening. Assimilation was seen in much better light because of these things, because it was considered to be a way of advancing Aboriginal people. So we still see this belief among Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in colonised countries around the world. The belief that the further they assimilate, the better off they are. And the reason why there are some Indigenous people who think that way is because their minds have been colonised, which of course was the whole point of colonisation. So at the time, Charles Darwin's theories of evolution were often the foundation of the settlers' views on Aboriginal people, that their skin colour made them inferior, that they were a lower form of life. This is evident in the term terra nullius that was applied when when the settlers arrived here in Australia. Basically, they declared the place terra nullius, which meant that they didn't recognise any human occupation of the land. The thing is, this notion of terra nullius was only dismissed in the early 1990s through Mabo. So for a long time, Aboriginal people really didn't have a place to negotiate, a foundation to negotiate, to do things with their lands, because legally their lands was considered terra nullius. So the government's attitude towards Aboriginal people have underpinned the policy failures that have occurred in Aboriginal policy. Now, when these policy failings occur, we have a group of people who sit down in an office getting paid well. They develop these policies, they allocate the funding to the policies, and then when these things fail, these people are moved on to another project. The people who are blamed by society for these failings are typically Aboriginal people who did not even have a seat at the table to determine these policies, to determine the funding allocations, typically they have not been consulted at all. But still, there's a culture of blaming Aboriginal people for policy failings, despite the fact that they are not consulted. In the main, Indigenous policies around the world have been developed and implemented with the aim of transforming Indigenous people into white people. Indigenous people have never really had the power to contribute to policy development and policy implementation. Slogans have been too easily used in the articulation of Indigenous policies. However, they do nothing to assist policies. Another problem has been constant changing of Aboriginal policies. This has meant that Aboriginal people are constantly adapting to these policy changes. Policies need time to become embedded in people's lives. These changes that take place in Aboriginal policies do so because of changes in government, election fears, changes in policy direction. This is where we hear politicians saying we have injected all of this money into Aboriginal health or housing, for example, when really very little actually gets to be used on the ground for those purposes. Now, it's probably a good idea that you explore that a little yourself, okay? That's a really good thing to find out about. Now, the protection approach, for example, did nothing for Aboriginal people. It did not mean that they were receiving wages or would be entitled to any other human rights. In fact, at the core of this policy was the belief that Aboriginal people would die out. This is largely how most Australians have come to know Aboriginal people today, through these policies of transformation. So terms such as full blood, half caste, quarter caste, these are terms that have come about through the use of those policies and are still the way people see Aboriginal people today. See, this is what we can do when we're in power. When we're in the power group, we can ask others to justify who they are, to tell us about their culture, to question whether they are a full Aboriginal. But nobody questions us, and we don't contemplate those things ourselves. Okay? And we don't even think about that because we are in the power group.